Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Convocation. We're delighted to have you here, and I think you're going to very much enjoy our special guest speaker, Dr. Tyler VanderWeele. Tyler has been a friend for many years, and we are super excited to have him. He serves as the Loeb Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He has an amazing academic pedigree, having earned degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Originally from Chicago, but having spent significant time in Costa Rica, Bulgaria, and Austria, he's married and has a son and lives in Cambridge, is a fan of classical music and playing the piano, but has been an incredibly productive scholar. At Harvard, he directs the Human Flourishing Program, which is the content that he's going to be sharing today on the subject of human flourishing, which will be amazing. He's also co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality at Harvard University. Tyler's research has been focused on psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, as well as the study of the relationship between religion and health. He's the author of 2 books and over 300 peer-reviewed academic journals. He's also a deeply committed follower of Jesus Christ and a wonderful brother in the faith. Tyler, we're delighted to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us at Gordon's Academic Convocation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Michael, and really am delighted to be able to be with you here today. As Michael indicated, I will be presenting today some work on the promotion of human flourishing. I will be making some remarks on the concept of flourishing itself. I'll talk a little bit about how we try to go about assessing flourishing in practice, both for research purposes and in our own lives. And then I'll talk about some various psychological and individual pathways, as well as community pathways to try to enhance flourishing. Much of what I'll be presenting today can be found in greater detail in these 2 papers in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the Journal of Positive Psychology and Well-Being. You can access those on the Human Flourishing Program's website at Harvard University, and there's more information as well if you would like to sign up for our monthly research updates or follow us on Twitter. So many academic disciplines aspire to grand visions of human flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Economics sometimes describes itself as a discipline that attempts to study how agents maximize their expected utility, which supposedly takes into account all aspects of the agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology has sometimes been defined as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But if we turn to our individual studies, we often find that they restrict attention not to these grand visions of flourishing and well-being, but rather to specific disease states or very simple measures of positive affect, or simply look at income, not all aspects of an agent's preferences. So what is flourishing? Well, if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines flourishing as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin, florere, to bloom, blossom, flower. The word is often used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition we've been using in our research at the Human Flourishing Program is that flourishing, or a state of complete human well-being, is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. This is arguably what we're after as individuals and should be after as a society. And there are numerous approaches to try to assess this in practice. We might wonder, with a conception so broad, how would we go about studying such a thing, or even thinking about it? And a number of measures have been put forward in the positive psychology literature to assess various aspects of subjective well-being. But notably absent from these assessments of psychological well-being are any notion of physical health. And are we fully flourishing if we're not healthy? Are we fully flourishing if we're bedridden, say? Also generally missing from these assessment approaches are any notion of character or virtue. Contrary to Plato, Aristotle, pretty much the whole of the Western philosophical and theological tradition and religious and cultural traditions worldwide. But then how still, with a conception so broad, would we possibly go about assessing flourishing? And certainly won't there be disagreement? Won't understandings of flourishing vary across persons and cultural and philosophical and religious traditions? How could we possibly achieve consensus on this? And what I would argue is that while conceptions of flourishing or human well-being will indeed vary across cultural and religious and philosophical traditions, I think we can identify elements that are common to all of these traditions. And so I would propose the following 5 domains of human life as being central to flourishing. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but that any reasonable conception of flourishing, whatever else it might include, would include these 5 domains as well. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but are arguably a part of it. Certainly from a Christian understanding of flourishing, we'd want to include spiritual well-being. How that's understood is, of course, going to vary across religious traditions, but it would be part of a Christian conception of flourishing. So these things don't exhaust flourishing, but I think any reasonable conception of flourishing would include these 5 as well. Each of these domains, I think, is also nearly universally desired, and we have empirical data on this now as well. Each also constitutes its own end. It's sought for its own sake, not simply as a means to something else. And I think these 2 criteria, being nearly universally desired and being its own end, can help shape consensus around what to measure and assess when we try to study and understand and promote human flourishing. So as a very short, crude assessment of flourishing, we've proposed a Flourishing Index, which in each of these 5 domains selects 2 different questions, principally drawn from questions already used with considerable frequency in the well-being literature and that have received some degree of empirical validation. The only 2 newly proposed questions were those on character and virtue. And although there's been quite a bit of work that's been done in the last 15 years on the assessment of character, there are very few broader global questions or items concerning character. And so we worked with philosophers to develop 2 questions that relate somewhat crudely to what are sometimes called the 4 cardinal virtues, the notion that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4: practical wisdom or prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation. And so these 10 questions are as follows. In the first domain, happiness and life satisfaction, we asked, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? 0, not at all satisfied; 10, completely satisfied. And then something more about how one feels about life as well. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? The second domain, physical and mental health, questions that are taken from the World Health Organization surveys and the General Survey in the United States. In general, how would you rate your physical health? 0 to 10. Or how would you rate your overall mental health? 0 to 10. In the third domain, meaning and purpose, first, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? Once again, 0 to 10. And this question is used with considerable frequency. It's used in the UK national survey. It's used by the OECD as well. But then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. 0, completely disagree. 10, completely agree. Then the fourth domain, character and virtue. 2 questions. The first, very crudely, attempting to assess practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. And then another question, essentially attempting to assess in a crude way fortitude and temperance. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later. Each of these is assessed 0, completely untrue of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then in the final domain, concerning social relationships, 2 questions taken from the UK's campaign to end loneliness, a review of measurement items. I am content with my friendships and relationships, essentially trying to assess the quantity of them. And then my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to assess the quality of those relationships. We usually, in our work, look at each of these 5 domains separately, but we'll sometimes also average the 5 scores together for an overall score of 0 to 10 in a very crude way, trying to assess flourishing in life so that we can study it and understand its determinants and try to promote it. But really that average is nothing more than an average of the 5 scores in each of the individual domains. We do also supplement this approach with 2 questions on financial and material stability, essentially to try to assess whether an individual has the means to try to sustain these other domains of flourishing over time. These 2 questions are how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses, and how often do you worry about safety, food, and housing? And so sometimes we'll average the 12 questions together to get more of a secure flourishing index, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources really are means, not ends, but may be more satisfactory in practice insofar as it indicates flourishing over time. I would like to pause for a couple of minutes and just ask each of you individually to go through these 10 or 12 questions with regard to your own life and score yourself on each of them. We've often found that people do find that sort of exercise helpful for reflection, for understanding their own life, and also for identifying areas in which they might want to work on or improve. And in the second half of the talk, I'll be talking about some of the individual activities and also aspects of community participation that might be helpful in enhancing these various domains of flourishing. So I am going to pause for 2 minutes. I realize this is perhaps a little bit more awkward on video than it would be in person, but I would like each of you to reflect on each of these questions and just try to, best you can, score yourself on each of them. So I'll pick up again in about two minutes, and we'll proceed with our discussions further. So we've collected data on these questions from over 100,000 participants in different educational and workplace and medical and even national samples. And when we've done this, I think many people have found the exercise itself very, very helpful for reflection. Some of the feedback we've had is these questions made me stop and think, or it was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on. Some have expressed relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. For others, it's been personally challenging. I was caught slightly off guard with the questions around purpose. I'm missing a greater purpose. I need to reach out to help more and to give back. So I think it can be helpful for self-reflection, for identifying areas of improvement or changes one wants to make in life, and also for tracking over time to assess how things are going. But we can also use this sort of approach to try to understand the determinants of these different aspects of well-being and to see what's happening to the well-being of a community or of our country. And in fact, we've done this in the midst of COVID-19. We've collected data on these domains, both before the declaration of the pandemic in January 2020, and also in the middle of it in June 2020. And the means and the standard deviations of each of these domains is given here. Unsurprisingly, overall flourishing has declined, and I think that's in line with people's intuitions. But interestingly, it's affected these domains very differently. So for happiness and life satisfaction, we've seen pretty substantial falls. Perhaps, again, unsurprisingly, same with mental and physical health, really substantial declines in financial and material stability, reflecting, of course, the much greater levels of unemployment. But interestingly, much smaller declines with meaning and purpose, with character, and even with social relationships. And that was a bit surprising to see. Also interesting is each of those domains, the variance has gone up. So although perhaps social relationships has not on average fallen all that much, there's much more variability. So for some, this time has in fact enhanced their social relationships. They've had time to invest in family and friends. But for others, it's been very difficult. Perhaps those who are socially isolated or living alone, this has been a time for real challenge. So we need to understand not just the means, but also the individual experiences. But with data like this, we can begin to understand what is going well, what is not going well, what really needs to be addressed and improved. But with data like this, we might then wonder, well, can we improve flourishing? And if so, how do we do so? And this has been a question that positive psychologists have been asking for a number of decades. And I think there's been some interesting and important work that's been done in positive psychology on this topic, which can be useful and helpful in individual practice. I think there are limitations, and positive psychology sometimes critiqued for having too much emphasis on the individual and not enough on community or society, and I will come back to those points. But I do think we have learned things from positive psychology. People have worked on activities or do-it-yourself interventions that one can use to try to enhance various aspects of well-being. And these have been tested in randomized trials, the sorts of designs we use to try to figure out whether drug A or drug B is better to treat disease. The same designs have been used to evaluate these activities to promote well-being. And so I'll be describing a number of these that might be helpful in your own life. Some to kind of enhance positive well-being and others to address difficulties like depression or anxiety or anger. So perhaps the most well-studied of these in the positive psychology literature are gratitude interventions. Gratitude sometimes conceived of as simple affirmation that something good has happened, possibly recognizing that someone else is largely responsible for the benefit. Certainly from a Christian perspective, we often express gratitude to God. And different approaches to try to do this on a regular basis or on an occasional basis have been developed. One of them is, for example, 3 times a week, write down 3 things that you're grateful for and why they came about, and do this for 6 weeks. And in randomized trials, these have been found to increase happiness, to lower self-reported health symptoms, to relieve depressive symptoms, to improve sleep. My wife and I try to do this over dinner on a regular basis, and when we do forget for a week or two, I feel I do notice the difference in the dynamics. So I think these gratitude exercises are important within the Christian context. Of course, that can also take place within prayer. An alternative variation of this is write a letter to someone to whom you are grateful and who has not been properly thanked, and send the letter. And likewise, that has been shown to improve various aspects of well-being, perhaps more substantially so immediately, but then somewhat less so over time. But I think cultivating that practice of gratitude can be very important, important within the Christian life, important also enhancing well-being. Another set of these sorts of activities that has been well studied within positive psychology are carrying out acts of kindness. Carry out acts of kindness that you would not otherwise ordinarily do. And so one approach, one where there's some evidence that this is most effective in promoting well-being, is that for 6 weeks, choose 1 day a week, and on that day, try to do 5 acts of kindness that you otherwise wouldn't ordinarily do. And there's some evidence that it's much more effective to choose 1 day with all 5 acts on the same day than to spread those out over the course of a week. For myself, my own personal practice, I try to do this every Lent, in fact. In addition to giving something up, I try to implement this acts of kindness. And I actually find it takes quite a bit of planning to do 5 in a single day that you wouldn't otherwise ordinarily do. But the effect oneself of orienting one's life and one's actions towards the other, towards loving the other, can be profound and powerful. So I think important from a Christian standpoint, but also evidence that this contributes to well-being. Evidence from randomized trials that it elevates one's levels of happiness, one's engagement, relieves to a certain extent anxiety, makes one feel more connected. Moreover, there's empirical evidence from randomized trials as well that when someone acts kindly to another, the other person's also more likely to go on to act kindly to others around them as well. That this kindness, this love, has a contagion that can be very powerful So again, this is also something that has been well studied in the positive psychology literature in randomized trials and have been found to have important effects on well-being. Another approach which has been somewhat less well studied, but still a handful of randomized trials on this as well, is to imagine one's best possible self, and from the Christian perspective to do so in light of God's love and our final end in God. But the approach is sometimes described as follows. Think about your life in the future. Imagine that everything has gone as well as it possibly could. You've worked hard and succeeded at accomplishing all of your life goals. Think of this as the realization of all your life dreams. Now write about what you have imagined. And so you reflect upon the best possible life with respect to your family, romantic partner, friends, career, health, hobbies, goals, your character, your life with God. And then write about goals and plans and actions that might help one to achieve the life of this best possible self that was envisioned. So this is more of a one-off exercise, maybe something you do once a year rather than once a week or several times a week. But this too can powerfully alter one's life in different ways. Again, evidence from randomized trials that it alters happiness and life satisfaction, increases optimism, helps one achieve a sense of flow. Another kind of do-it-yourself activity that has been studied in a handful of these randomized trials are what are sometimes called using one's character strengths. So a virtue in sort of the writings of Aristotle and Aquinas is sometimes conceived of as a habit in accord with reason to attain the good. And certainly within the Christian tradition and within most philosophical traditions, character is viewed as being a central part of well-being. And so the approach that's been studied in the positive psychology literature is to first identify one's own personal character strengths. And there's a survey that you can use, one is available on Penn's Authentic Happiness Questionnaire website. But out of 24 character strengths, you identify your top 5, and then you try to use each of these 5 strengths in a new and different way every day for 1 week. And again, evidence from randomized trials that this sort of using your character strengths in new ways leads to greater levels of happiness and relieves depressive symptoms. And so I think, likewise is a good exercise to attempt to do. Certainly from a Christian perspective, it's not all that we want to do with respect to character. We also want to identify our character weaknesses and work on those with God's help. That sort of work hasn't been studied as well, but perhaps should be in the future. So I've talked about a few different ways to kind of capitalize on one's strengths, resources, to emphasize the positive. But certainly some of life involves difficulties and suffering and encountering and working through those challenges from a spiritual perspective, but also making use of what we have learned from psychology and how to do so. And in terms of addressing questions of depression and of anxiety, decades of work has gone into how to go about changing our thought processes and behaviors that might contribute to depression, what's sometimes called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's very clear from randomized trials and meta-analyses of randomized trials, combining the evidence together, that these approaches are effective. And one of these cognitive behavioral therapy approaches for depression has been implemented into a variety of self-help books, but a particularly popular one, and one that has been studied in randomized trials as well, is David Byrne's Feeling Good book. And again, evidence from randomized trials that this does help alleviate at least moderate symptoms of depression. It's not a substitute for mental health professional, and certainly from a Christian standpoint, one would want to supplement this with an understanding and trying to make sense of, find meaning amidst the suffering one is experiencing. But I think this book can be helpful. When I was going through a difficult time during graduate school myself, in addition to seeking out spiritual and pastoral counseling, I read through this book and found it very helpful myself. So again, not a substitute for these other resources, but something that might be useful. Similar workbooks, less well studied, have been developed for anxiety. One that's been studied in one very small randomized trial, Mastery of Your Anxiety and Panic, by Barlow and Kraske. And again, some evidence that, that this also is helpful relieving anxiety. Probably needs further study, but these resources, I think, can be useful. A final resource I would like to briefly mention and discuss with regard to trying to address the real struggles in life that we deal with, and one that's, of course, particularly relevant from a Christian perspective, concerns forgiveness. We are called to forgive one another as God has forgiven us. And many people struggle with forgiveness. We've often been wrong, sometimes very painfully. So how do we go about forgiving others? I think one thing that can be helpful is understanding what forgiveness really is. And if forgiveness is understood really as simply replacing ill will towards the offender with goodwill, then we can begin to understand how it's always possible to forgive, even if the wrongdoer hasn't repented, or even if we feel that the sense of anger is still returning. If it's really a replacing of ill will towards the offender and wanting evil for them with goodwill, wanting good for them, if forgiveness is understood in that way, we can see that this is very different from condoning or reconciling or forgetting or justifying or not demanding justice or excusing. One can forgive, yet still pursue a just outcome. But many people still struggle to forgive, even those who want to forgive. And over the last 30 years, approaches have been developed to help people to forgive who want to forgive, but are having difficulty doing so. One of the prominent models that we're studying right now, in fact, in a large randomized trial, is Everett Worthington's REACH model. And this consists of 5 steps, each of which correspond to one letter of REACH. First, R, recall the hurt, remember what has been done. Don't try to suppress it, but identify what it is and let those feelings surface. E, empathize with the offender. Try to understand the offender's perspective without excusing the action or without denying the wrong that was done or your own feelings. But again, try to understand the offender. A, altruistic gesture of forgiveness. Can realize that forgiveness is something that you can offer or withhold. But it is a decision that you make. And remember also that you've done wrong as well, and others have forgiven you. God has forgiven you. C, commit to forgive. I mean, if possible, publicly or with a friend, perhaps. And then H, hold on to forgiveness. Hold on to forgiveness even though the emotions may come and go. And in this literature, I think an important distinction is sometimes made between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. Decisional forgiveness is the commitment to replace ill will towards the offender with goodwill. That's an act of the will. That's something you can decide. Emotional forgiveness is a healing of those negative emotions, and that's not entirely within one's control. And it will take time, but that decisional forgiveness can help that process of emotional forgiveness as well. And this REACH model has been studied in randomized trials and found to help improve forgiveness, but also to alleviate depressive symptoms, to alleviate anxiety, and to lead to greater hope. Many of these studies have involved trained counselors implementing this REACH model, but Everett Worthington has developed a do-it-yourself workbook that can be done in 3 hours. You can download it from his website. It's been examined in a couple of small randomized trials with fairly promising results. Right now, we're trying to study this in a cross-national context, in a large randomized trial in 5 countries, Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Hong Kong, to see if this approach of simply going through this workbook to help yourself to forgive might likewise be effective in achieving these outcomes of increasing forgiveness and alleviating depression and anxiety and leading to greater hope. If so, I think it might be possible for this sort of forgiveness workbook intervention to be disseminated widely, to promote forgiveness worldwide. And in these difficult times that we are experiencing in our country and worldwide with the divisions that we have, I think this approach of forgiveness, so central to the Christian life and the Christian message, could be powerful to promote flourishing if we could indeed distribute this work widely. So that is one of our goals at the Human Flourishing Program for the years ahead. But I think this approach can be very useful for one's own life as well. So if we go through these various activities and interventions from the positive psychology literature, we see from randomized trials that they often have important effects on increasing happiness, relieving depression, improving health in some cases. But interestingly, the effects on some of the other domains of flourishing, on purpose, on actually changing and improving character rather than simply using one's strengths, or on relationships, are much less clear. And many of the interventions that have been designed to try to target these, to try to target purpose, say, have in fact failed. The positive psychology interventions to try to improve purpose in life have not been very successful to date. And I think arguably for these other very human domains of flourishing, purpose, meaning, character, relationships, well, what we really need is not just individual activities, but communities. We need longer-term commitments. We need relationships. And so we've tried to study what can promote these other aspects of flourishing, of well-being also. And we've done this to a certain extent from a public health perspective. In public health, we often think of the importance of a particular intervention or phenomena or exposure as a factor of, as a function of two things. One is the prevalence of the exposure, or how common it is, and secondly, how large are its effects. And anything that's very common and has large effects on the outcomes we care about is going to powerfully shape population health. So if we look at physical health through this lens, we end up with determinants such as exercise and nutrition and not smoking and getting enough sleep. Each of these is common and has large effects on physical health. But we could ask the question, using the same lens, what's common and what has large effects on not just physical health, but all of the domains of flourishing: happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships. And if we ask that question, looking at all 5 domains, we end up with answers that look rather different than the determinants of physical health. And so based on a review of the literature, I would put forward 4. Family, work, education, and religious community. Each of these is relatively common in the population, and there's evidence from rigorous studies that each of these powerfully affects the flourishing domains. These 4 are not exhaustive. There may be other important pathways. Artistic or aesthetic experience, for example, may be important for some, but aren't just as common or as widespread as something like work or education. Also, each of these are not necessary for flourishing. Someone can flourish without participation in one of these pathways or areas of life or communities, but each does powerfully affect flourishing, and each is common. And if individual and policy efforts were put towards enhancing these different pathways, I think societal flourishing would substantially increase. So my other hat at the Harvard School of Public Health, in addition to studying well-being and religion from an empirical perspective, is also as a statistician and as a methodologist. And so we want to understand these determinants of flourishing, but to do so rigorously. And so in this literature review, I will, for just one slide, bore you with a few of these technical details. But I think it's important. I think it's important, if we want to come to truth, to study things rigorously. And so in this literature review, in that 2017 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we tried to look at only the most rigorous studies, those that were longitudinal over time, or were experimental, that randomized, or had something about them that almost made it look like they were experimental. So importantly, cross-sectional designs where data was collected on everything all at the same time were excluded, because it's very difficult to study and assess causality from these cross-sectional designs. And a couple of examples can be used to illustrate this. We know from a number of studies that marriage and happiness are correlated. But is that because marriage really causes happiness? Or is it because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? There is in fact evidence from both, but with cross-sectional data, we just can't tell. Likewise, there's evidence that religious service attendance protects against or is associated with lower depression. But is that because it really protects against depression, or is it because depressed people are more likely to leave religious services and other forms of community life as well? Once again, from cross-sectional data, we just can't tell. We need those longitudinal studies over time. And so this literature review is restricted to those longitudinal or experimental or quasi-experimental studies. And we looked for evidence that was really robust to potential confounding. In some cases, this required throwing out the vast majority of the studies. There's a large literature on religious community and that being associated with higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction. But at the time of this literature review, of the 100 studies out there on this topic, only one kind of met the criteria of rigor that we were looking for. There have been a couple since, and those do all indicate that religious community participation in church life is associated subsequently with higher levels of happiness, but we really can't tell from just the cross-sectional data. But based on this literature review, we were able to provide evidence from rigorous studies that each of these domains, family, work, education, and religious community, participation in these pathways contributed to each of those flourishing domains. So that if we were able to support or encourage these different pathways, flourishing really would be enhanced. There's evidence from Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, for example, and from many other sources that community life has been falling dramatically over the past decades. And I think this has profound implications for human flourishing. I think participating in communities that extend over time, that have a shared set of values and interests and purposes and vision for life, really are essential for the promotion of flourishing. I think for many of these can include family, workplace, education, religious community, going to church, participating in church life, being at Gordon College, participating in the student groups there and life there. You have at your disposal many of these pathways, important pathways for flourishing. And certainly there are others as well, volunteering, political organizations, arts communities. But I do think investing in these is important for a flourishing life. They do take time, they take commitment. It can be somewhat onerous as well, and one can often have to work through difficult conflicts, but long term, it is essential and it is valuable to invest in these, to work through those difficulties, to participate in these rich forms of community life. Individual psychology, individual activities, and interventions are not enough. They contribute, they help, we should make use of them, but we really need community life. We need the life of universities, we need the life of families. We need workplaces to be good, thriving communities themselves. And we need the church. We need these things to really fully thrive, to really fully flourish. So I'd like to make a few concluding remarks on kind of some of the implications and the future direction of these ideas. I think it's important to think about flourishing in a holistic perspective, including these 5 domains of life, but extending beyond that. And we're doing some work now on community well-being and on spiritual well-being. We've developed an initial version of a measure of Christian spiritual well-being, focusing on kind of flourishing from a distinctively Christian perspective. But I think we need to study these things, and I think we need to reflect on all of these different aspects of life. We're encouraged often by the media to focus principally on the economic or physical outcomes, and those are important. But life is more than that, and we need to continually be aware of that. We need to do that individually, and we need to do that in our research and in our policy decision-making. I think we need to better study some of these other aspects of flourishing that have been neglected, like character, like meaning and purpose in life. Why is it that we know so much more about the determinants of cardiovascular disease than we do about the determinants of what leads to a meaningful life? I'm all for studying cardiovascular disease, but I think we should be employing the same level of rigor to study what leads to a meaningful life, or how to promote character. We need better research support to study these other aspects of flourishing. I think government should start tracking flourishing measures over time, and the UK and the OECD and a handful of other countries have started doing this. There's some indication that the US may be doing so as well in the years ahead, possibly only one well-being question in the National Health Interview Survey, but it's progress, and we need to do a better job. Likewise, I think employers, medical centers, universities should start assessing flourishing over time, assessing how students are doing, how patients are doing, not just in terms of their physical health, but in their overall flourishing, assessing how employees are doing, and then effort should be made to try to improve it. What we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and policies put in place to achieve it. Measurement matters, and I think we should measure flourishing. We should aim for flourishing, both personally and as a community, as a nation, as a world. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for being here today. And I wish you all the best with your studies, with your life, with flourishing, both here and now and eternally. Thank you.